Hello and welcome to my talk, The Motion Sensor Western. I will start by introducing myself. My name is Ben Assi. I'm a computer scientist and a former Google employee. I'm a PhD student at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev and a researcher at Cyber at BGU. And my research focus are side channel attacks, sound recovery via non-acoustic data, security of autonomous vehicles, and you can read more about my research at my website or follow me on Twitter. This is the agenda for today. We will start by understanding the advantages of motion sensors. We will then cover the security risks and the privacy risks that motion sensors pose to devices and individuals. And at the end of the talk, I will discuss about the takeaways about this from this entire talk, and we will do the Q&A session. Let's start by understanding the good. Now, MEMS motion sensors are electrical devices that utilize a sensor to detect nearby motion. And in this talk, we focus on two specific motion sensors, which are the MEMS gyroscope, which is a device which is used to measure the angular velocity, and MEMS accelerometer, which is a device which is used to measure the rate of change of a velocity. Now, these motion sensors have many advantages, one of which is that they are very cheap. You can buy them on AliExpress and easily integrate them to your microcontrollers. They provide sufficient accuracy for many uses that I will discuss about later on. They consider low power consumers, so you can integrate them to battery-operated devices. They are very small. Each of your smartphones consists of a motion sensor. And as a result, motion sensors have become more and more ubiquitous in the last few years, ever since they were integrated to iPhone. And they are now integrated in many IoT devices, and this includes smartphones and tablets, and smartwatches, and fitness trackers, and drones, and even in some headphones, and in many other IoT devices. Now, their data is used for various tasks, and this includes real-time automatic user gesture recognition. Or for example, this is smartphones detects lifting by analyzing data from motion sensors. Also, real-time automatic stabilization, which is, for example, in GoPro cameras, which are stabilized automatically. This is also done by obtaining and analyzing data from motion sensors. They provide improved gaming experience. For example, they can turn a smartphone into an air joystick. Also, they provide real-time user activity recognition. Now, for example, detecting walking. And user health monitoring, for example, counting steps. And finally, they are also used for navigation. They are part of IMUs. And here's an interesting fact. Most everyone in the audience is being sampled by motion sensors in at least one device for most of the day. Okay, so let's understand the bad. And when I say the bad, I actually mean to the security of the devices containing motion sensors. Now, in 2007, resonant acoustic injection frequency was identified as a problem that causes performance degradation of MEMS motion sensors. It was found by several studies. And most MEMS gyroscope and accelerometers have a unique resonant frequency that is related to the physical characteristics of their structure. And as a result of this resonance, MEMS motion sensors generate an unexpected output that may cause the related system to malfunction in response to sound played at the resonant frequency. Now, these resonant frequencies are often considered to be commercial secrets. However, previous studies have already found that the resonant frequency for MEMS gyroscope are somewhere between 8 kHz and 28 kHz, and for MEMS accelerometer is somewhere between 2 kHz and 13 kHz. So, An immediate question that arises is how attackers can find or identify the resonant frequency of a motion sensor if it is not already known. And basically, they need to apply the following attack, which is the resonant acoustic injection frequency attack. And first of all, they need, given a motion sensor, the range around the resonant frequency can be detected as follows. They need to produce a signal of a frequency scan, which some of you maybe know as chirp or sweep. And it is better to produce it in the range of the frequencies that I just discussed on. Now, the next thing that they need to do is to play the signal via speakers in proximity to the motion sensor. And finally, they need to look for anomalies in the output of the motion sensor or the behavior of the containing device and identify the resonant frequency based on these anomalies. So what are the anomalies that attackers need to look for when they apply the resonant acoustic injection frequency attack? So as you can see, the picture on the right side shows how the original output of a gyroscope, which you can see it in red, was changed in response to the attack, which you can see the changed output in blue. And you can see that in some cases, like this case, the attack increases the output, the gyroscope output standard deviation, the range, the absolute minimum and maximum values, and basically you get the idea. In other cases, like the case that you can see in the picture on the right, the attack completely distorts the original signal. And as you can see, by applying the attack, attackers can control the output of the motion sensor. And as you can see, these results clearly show that attackers can spoof the output of a target motion sensor and affect the algorithms that rely on the motion sensor output. Now, here's the question. Given that the resonant frequency of a motion sensor is known, either it was identified or either it was known in advance, what are the risks that the resonant acoustic injection frequency attack poses to devices? And I would like to start by introducing an interesting attack. Now, as I mentioned before, gyroscopes are integrated to probably most of the drones nowadays. And the drone is a real-time system that continuously uses the data obtained from the gyroscope to stabilize itself while flying. And basically, the following operation is being executed several times a second. Measurements from the gyroscope are obtained for each axis, and the drone stabilizes itself by adjusting the copter's velocity according to these measurements. Now, as I mentioned before, this procedure is executed a few times on each second by a drone's operating system. Now, in 2016, a group of scientists demonstrated a new technique aimed at interfering with the drone's flight. They actually applied the attack that I described before, and they showed that by applying the resonant acoustic injection frequency attack against drones, they were able to prevent the drone on the ground from ascending and crashing a flying drone. Now, as you can see in this picture, this was their experimental setup. The drone actually unable to ascend because of the array of speakers that is being directed to him and is connected to a laptop which produces this signal around the resonant frequency. Now, as I mentioned before, accelerometers are also integrated in the vast majority of the smartwatches and fitness trackers. And they are used to track many of the activities performed by the user. Now, for example, this can be step counting. Now, many companies incentivize people to exercise by offering reward programs tied to their personal fitness tracking wristbands. Now, basically, it means that the user can earn free points by reaching a daily target of steps. Now, you can see it in the advertisement above. In 2017, a group of scientists demonstrated a new technique to spoof the step counter, and they were able to show that by applying 40 minutes of the resonant acoustic injection frequency attack against the fitness tracker, attackers were able to register more than 2,000 steps and earn 21 reward points on this website without taking any single step. Now I want to summarize the part of security of devices that consists of that contain motion sensors, and the availability and integrity of devices with integrated motion sensors can be violated by the resonant acoustic injection frequency attack. However, spoofing a device with the motion sensors requires the attacker to place the speakers in proximity to the attack device, and this is because sound deteriorates significantly with distance. And the main conclusion is that the feasibility of this attack is highly dependent on the attack device and the reality of the threat model. Now, there are some good news. In some cases, the attack isn't considered a practical threat. Now, for example, crashing a flying drone used for deliveries is not practical using this attack. And this is because it is hard to apply the attack from great distances. And bear in mind that drones usually fly in high altitudes. However, there are some bad news. In other cases, the attack is considered a practical threat. And now, for example, spoofing the step counter of a smartwatch, because attackers can attack their own devices and spoof the integrity of the data of the step counter. Okay, so let's understand what is ugly about motion sensors. And when I discuss about this section, I mainly refer to the how this data can be used to violate individuals' privacy. Now, motion sensors are integrated to smartphones and smartwatch. I discussed about it before, and this part focuses on data, motion sensor data obtained from smartphones and smartwatches. Now, smartphones and smartwatches are very unique devices because they are carried almost 24/7 by the users. And here's a question: how can attackers obtain motion sensor data from these devices? So there are two primary ways that attackers can obtain motion sensor data. The first way is directly from these devices, and this can be done by sampling the motion sensor via the browser when a user visits a compromised website, and this can be the result, for example, of a phishing attack. Another way is by sampling the motion sensor via an installed malicious application, and another way is by sampling the motion sensor via a malicious SDK integrated in a legitimate application. This is the direct way to obtain motion sensor data from these devices. However, there is the indirect way, and as you know, data from devices is collected and sent to data centers, and attackers can obtain data indirectly by hacking a legitimate application data center and exfiltrate the data to their possess. Now, let us assume that attackers were able to obtain motion sensor data. What are the risks that this data poses to individuals? Now, here's an interesting case study and an interesting question. Can motion sensor data be used to recover speech? Now, surprisingly, at Usenix Security 14, 7 years ago, a group of scientists found that gyroscopes also capture acoustics. Now, they were able to classify isolated words by analyzing gyroscope data. They named their paper in their research Gyrophone. And 7 years ago, the attack was considered somehow very impractical, and this was because back then, a smartphone operating system limited the sampling rate from the gyroscope to about 200 Hertz. Now, as a result, the accuracy of their model, which relied on K nearest neighbor, was only slightly better than a random guess. And also, the attack vector relied on a very loud speech. So basically, I consider this attack 7 years ago as impractical. However, during the last 7 years, the practicality of the method has improved significantly. And from 2015 to 2019, an increased understanding regarding this attack vector was gained. And the first insight was that MEMS accelerometers are more sensitive to acoustics than gyroscopes. And also a second insight that was gained is that the effect of acoustics of motion sensors is increased when the smartphone and the speakers share the same physical surface. And these two insights somehow increase the practicality of this entire threat model of recovering sound via motion sensor data. Now, finally, about a year ago, a group of scientists showed and presented an exciting research at NDSS, and they showed that they were able to improve the attack vector significantly and make it a practical threat to privacy. And this was mainly the result of that in some smartphones nowadays, the operating system allow a sampling rate of 500 Hertz. And also they use a different type of classification method, which they actually use neural networks were used to classify the isolated words instead of the KNN approach that was used by the guys from Gyrophone. And this yields excellent accuracy of classification. Also, in their case, the attack vector relies on speech at normal volume rather than in high volume, as was in the case of Gyrophone. And as a result, they made the attack very practical. Now, here is some bad news. If smartphones manufacturers will allow a greater sampling rate of the integrated motion sensors in the future, we might even face a greater problem, which is a complete sound recovery of the speech, which we will take the signal and the signal will be perceptible and understood to the human ear, rather than what these methods are able to provide now, which is a classification of isolated words with preliminary dictionary. Now, here's another question to the audience. Now, can motion sensor data be used for keylogging? Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of keylogging, keylogging is the process of recovering the typed text or password from data. And various methods were already suggested to create keyloggers. Now, keylogging is usually done by analyzing data influenced by the side effects of typing. Now, for example, acoustic data obtained from microphone can be used to recognize or to identify the keys that are typed or pressed. Now, if a user wears a smartwatch while typing on a keyboard, we expect that the data from the motion sensor, we expect this data to indicate the movement of the wrist on the keyboard. However, attackers still need to overcome a primary challenge, which is the missing information. Now, assuming that the user wears the smartwatch on his left hand, attackers can only recover the characters on the left side of the keyboard. So the characters that were typed on the right side of the keyboard are missing in the word that they are trying to recover. Now, various studies have suggested methods to fill in the missing gaps. And the first stage that they suggested is attackers can easily detect strokes on the left side of the keyboard by analyzing data from motion sensors. And the next thing is that attackers can identify missing strokes on the right side of the keyboard by analyzing the motion sensor signal in the time domain. And by doing so, they can identify gaps and infer the number of missing characters. Now, attackers can use a statistical model to fill in the missing characters using a dictionary, and surprisingly, this approach was implemented in various studies, showing good accuracy in recovering typing. Now, the conclusions. Keylogging of the QWERTY keyboard via a smartwatch motion sensor is quite practical. Now, the same approach can be used to recover text typed on a smartphone touchscreen keyboard. And keylogging of pin codes via a smartwatch motion sensor is only possible if the user uses the hand with the smartwatch to press the buttons. The dictionary in this case won't help him because pin codes are not something that can be statistically, that can help statistically to recover the missing password. Okay, now the last case study is another question that I want you to think of is, can motion sensor data be used to detect whether an individual was intoxicated? And let us assume that the answer is yes. The risks to individuals' privacy are as follows. The primary risk is that in some Muslim countries around the world, intoxication is prohibited by law, and governments penalize citizens for violating this law. Now, the secondary is that this approach can be used to learn about another individual habits, now, for example, by parents to learn about their child. Now, assuming that a party was able to obtain an individual motion sensor data, can the data be used by this party to determine whether the individual was intoxicated or not? So, police officers are trained to identify an intoxicated individual based on their gait. Now, you are all probably familiar with the walk and turn sobriety test. And this field, the sobriety test, has been used by police officers for many years. And here's the question. We actually ask a different type of question. Can we identify whether a person is intoxicated by analyzing motion sensor data obtained from an individual's smartphone and smartwatch during a free gait? Now, bear in mind, police officers use a dedicated sobriety test in order to identify whether an individual is intoxicated or not. We want to do it from a person free gait, an individual's free gait. Okay, so we actually performed a case study in order to answer this question, and the findings are described in the following paper, which you can find easily online. It's called The Age of Testifying Wearable Devices, the Case of Intoxication Detection. It was co-authored by myself, Professor Lior Rokach, and Professor Yuval Alovich. Now, the first thing that we actually did is we conducted an experiment. The experiment took place at 3 different bars. 30 individuals participated in the experiment, and each individual was asked to walk twice with a smartwatch and a smartphone for 16 seconds, where only 8 seconds of the motion sensor data was used. Now, the first walk took place before the individual started to drink, and the second walk took place after the individual completed to drink, and the second time we also measured the breath alcohol concentration level of each of the participants with a professional breathalyzer. Now, for each individual, we extracted 2 feature vectors. One vector was extracted from the data obtained before the individual started to drink. The second vector was extracted from the data obtained after the individual completed to drink. And the vectors consist of the exact same features, which are the statistical features, distribution in the time domain, distribution in the frequency domain, and known gait features. Now, also, for each individual, we subtracted the values of the second vector from the first vector and created a vector of differences. We labeled the vector of differences with the breath alcohol concentration sample that was taken from the breathalyzer. And we ended up with 30 vectors, 1 for each participant, that indicate the difference in a person's free gait labeled by their breath alcohol concentration level. Now, let's understand the results. Now, we examine whether an individual intoxication level can be determined for various Braque levels. And we compare the results of 2 machine learning algorithms, which are the gradient boosting classifier and the AdaBoost classifier. Now, you can see the ROC graphs on the right side. And we found that our models can identify intoxicated individuals with the breath alcohol concentration level greater than 220 with an area under curve of 0.91. However, the models aren't perfect. They each have false positive and false negative detections. And in some cases, we cannot tolerate a specific type of mistake, and we want to evaluate the model's performance with respect to various policies. So here's the question. Is it possible to tune the model to detect all intoxicated subjects so we won't miss any intoxicated individual? So actually, this can be done by setting the model's true positive rate at 1 and analyzing how this policy affected the false positive rate. Basically, how many sober individuals are misdetected as a result of applying this policy. Now, in general, as you can see in the table on the right side, we found that the false positive rate remains very low when we are looking on breath alcohol concentration levels which are greater than 220. Now here's another question. Is it possible to tune the model so all individuals detected as intoxicated by the models are actually intoxicated? Now, again, the answer is yes, and this can be accomplished by setting the model's false positive rate at 0 and analyzing how this policy affected the true positive rate. Basically, how many intoxicated individuals are missed as a result of deploying this policy. Now, in general, you can see that this policy can result in many errors where only about 60% of the intoxicated individuals are detected as intoxicated, while in some cases 40% and even 50% of the individuals are missed by this model, are considered as sober. Okay, so we're about to discuss about the takeaways from this talk, and the first takeaway is that the primary risk that motion sensors currently pose is to individuals' privacy rather than posing a threat to a device security. And many people don't consider data from motion sensors a privacy risk. However, attackers can derive various insights about users by analyzing motion sensor data, and this can be done for recovering speech, for keylogging, to detect whether an individual is intoxicated, and also as an alternative way to locate a user without any GPS measurement, and also for user identification. Now, currently, the most practical way to obtain motion sensor data requires the attacker to install an application on an IoT device in order to obtain motion sensor data. However, we expect that ongoing external changes like the adoption of 5G and increased commercial interest in motion sensor data will result in increased data collection by third parties. And as a result, we believe that in the near future, obtaining motion sensor data via third parties will become more practical than installing a malicious application. So we believe that the common threat model to obtain motion sensor data is about to be changed in the near future due to external changes. Now, another interesting takeaway is that consider our understanding about the privacy risks associated with motion sensor data. We are quite surprised that such data can be obtained without any user permission. And these are 3 snapshots that are taken from my smartphone. Now you can see one good application that I usually use, which called AndroSensor. You can see how data from accelerometer and gyroscope is presented by this application. However, no permission is granted to sample motion sensor data by this application at all. Now, a user's motion, basically it means that a user's motion sensor data might be used for recovering speech, and the user won't suspect at all. Now, the last point I want you to think of is that throughout the entire talk, we consider the fact that deriving insights about a user by analyzing the collected motion sensor data is a violation of the user's privacy. And this is true from a user's perspective. Now, what about the bigger picture? So, in the last few years, in a few well-known cases, a user's motion sensor data was used to contradict a husband report of his wife, time of death, which completely changed the course of the investigation by enabling the police to prove that the wife was walking around an hour after her husband told the police she was shot by an invader. And as a result, the police arrested this man for murdering his own wife. In another well-known and famous case, this data was used to charge a woman with false reporting after her Fitbit contradicted her rape claim by proving that she was actually walking around at the time in question. And the last takeaway that I want you to think of or to take from this talk is that the answer to the question of whether we want to allow a party to analyze an individual's motion sensor data depends on the use case. In some use cases, this data can help the police to solve many crimes. Now, I would like to thank you for attending my talk, and let's start the session of the Q&A.